Guys, welcome to your notes on respiration. So our objective today is to identify how the reactants and products of cellular respiration relate to photosynthesis. And so you guys remember from your notes on the energy cycle that glucose and oxygen are the things that are going into cellular respiration. This occurs in the mitochondria, and it all happens because we're trying to produce ATP so the cells can do work. The byproducts of this process, or the waste from this process, are carbon dioxide and water. So let's take a look at respiration. It's defined as the conversion of food molecules into ATP. And when we talk about food at the most basic level, we're talking about glucose. So right here, C6H12O6. Definitely be familiar with that chemical formula, as well as the name glucose. So I would write both of those down, C6H12O6 and glucose. At its most basic, this is a simple sugar, right? It's a carbohydrate, and it's what our body is able to use from the food that we eat to make energy. We also need to have oxygen. That's why we breathe. So this is why we eat. This is why we breathe. These two things combined go into the process of respiration that happens in the mitochondria. The waste products are CO2, which we breathe out, and water, which some of it is actually breathed out, and some of it maintains in our body to help maintain homeostasis. And then we get this ATP. So if we think about the reactants and products in photosynthesis, how do they relate to respiration? Remember, what comes out of photosynthesis goes into respiration. What comes out of respiration goes into photosynthesis. So the mitochondria is the site of aerobic cellular respiration. So we learned a little bit about mitochondria in our unit on cells. We learned that it's the powerhouse of the cell and it's where energy is produced. And so this is going to be one of the main organelles that we'll be focusing on in this unit. So aerobic respiration, if you think about the word aerobic, I always remember it this way, that air sounds like air that we breathe in, and it has oxygen in it. So aerobic respiration requires oxygen. It's a really important term to know. This process produces 38 ATP from every 1 molecule of glucose. Some single-celled organisms do this, but all multicellular organisms do this. Now, when I say some single-celled organisms, we'll talk about ones that don't do this later on. But all multicellular organisms, so anything that on this planet that is larger than 1 cell does aerobic respiration. Okay? So keep that in mind as we move forward with this unit. There's 3 main steps of aerobic respiration. And so we're going to go into the details on each of those, but I just wanted to show you this little diagram. So this represents the mitochondria, this little gray guy out here, and this blue area is the cytosol. So remember, that's the liquid inside the cell. So glycolysis is one of the steps. That's when we take glucose and we turn it into pyruvic acid. We get some ATP here. Then this whole process moves into the mitochondria. And within the mitochondria, we have something called the Krebs cycle and then electron transport. And you can see that most of the ATP is produced in this last step here. So let's take a look at each of those steps. Glycolysis is literally just breaking sugar in half. So glyco refers to the glucose or sugar, and lysis means to cut. So we're basically taking glucose and we're cutting it in half. So remember, our glucose is C6H12O6. So that means there's 6 carbons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All these things occur, and eventually down here at the bottom, I have 1 molecule here, 1 molecule here. Each has 3 carbons. So I've basically taken glucose, cut it in half. But as you can see in that process, I've made some ATP, right? So I get 2 ATP from glucose. This part is actually considered anaerobic. It doesn't need oxygen. There's no oxygen involved in this step. It just happens out there in the cytosol, and every organism on the planet does this. So this is the one step that everything can do. Even those single-celled organisms can do this part. Now, if oxygen is present, we take that pyruvic acid that was our product at the end of glycolysis, and it's going to move into the mitochondria. That's only if oxygen is present. If there's no oxygen, it stays out here and it does something else, which we'll talk about later. Okay, so now we're doing the aerobic respiration part in step 2. This is the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle simply takes that pyruvic acid and it breaks down the sugar completely. It essentially pulls the sugars all the way apart. And in the process, you can see here some CO2 is released at different steps, and some ATP is produced right here. Not super important that you know this cycle. All you really need to understand is that it is aerobic. It happens in the mitochondria. We get CO2 and ATP produced here. Okay, this is also known as the citric acid cycle. And the reason for that is because one of the products of it is citric acid. Krebs was the guy who basically discovered it and described the cycle, and he named it the citric acid cycle, but later on it was named after him, giving him credit for having discovered it. And then finally, step 3, we call electron transport, and this is where most of our ATP is created. And what happens is we use these electrons to power this pump, ATP synthase, to make ATP. So anytime we see this ASE at the end of a word, it tells us it's an enzyme. So to synthesize something means to make it. So basically an enzyme that makes ATP, right? So we have membrane proteins here embedded in the mitochondrial membrane. And what they do is, as that sugar is being pulled apart, these electrons are being released, these H pluses, and they are pumped across the membrane. And as they are pumped across the membrane, it helps to power the movement of these other electrons down through this transport chain. Okay, so electrons move along here. These hydrogens are getting pumped. We're creating a concentration gradient here. We're getting a high amount of H pluses out here. We have a low amount of H pluses down here. And so as the concentration increases here, they're going to simply move down the concentration gradient through our ATP synthase molecule. And as they move down, it's like if you've ever seen water going through a dam. As water rushes through a dam, it spins turbines, and those turbines create energy. Same idea. As the H pluses move through this enzyme, it moves the enzyme, and as that enzyme moves, it is powering the production of ATP. And again, you don't need to know all of the crazy details of how this all happens. Just understand that electron transport is going to produce about 34 ATPs from one molecule of glucose, and it's because hydrogen, these H pluses are accumulating outside of this membrane, and then as they pass through the ATP synthase, they're helping to power the production of ATP. Okay, so aerobic respiration requires oxygen, happens in the mitochondria. We break down glucose and we make ATP during electron transport. So make sure that you have the notes all ready to go for when they are due, and I will address any questions that you have in class. Thanks for watching.